The 1980s was a decade when global politics was shaped by the rivalry between two world superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War, which had begun after World War II, played out across every continent and took many forms, from nuclear standoffs to backing different political regimes in developing countries. For the US, fighting the spread of communism became the main focus of foreign policy. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who took office in 1981, the American government actively supported anti-communist movements around the globe. Reagan viewed communism as a global threat and believed that any government that deviated from the Western model was essentially part of the Soviet system. One such government targeted by US policy was the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas came to power in 1979 after a revolution that overthrew the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza, who had been backed by the US. After taking control, the revolutionaries announced socialist reforms and formed close ties with Cuba and the USSR. For the United States, this was seen as a new ideological threat emerging right in Central America. In 1981, Reagan made the decision to support the Contras, anti-communist rebels fighting against the Sandinista government. These rebels included former soldiers from Somoza's army, rural residents who rejected socialist rule, and other opposition groups. However, US support for the Contras was highly controversial. Their tactics often included extremely harsh methods, such as violent intimidation and actions against civilians that led to serious humanitarian concerns. For Reagan, though, the main goal was pushing back against communism in Latin America, not humanitarian issues. He believed that supporting the Contras would help change the political landscape in Nicaragua and push the Soviets out of the Southern Hemisphere. This was part of the broader domino strategy, which claimed that any country falling under Soviet or communist influence could affect its neighbors, spreading that ideology throughout the region. The US began sending the Contras money, equipment, and other forms of assistance. But eventually, these actions raised serious international questions about their legality and ethics. Over time, the situation became increasingly controversial. Specifically, the matter of US support for the Contras caused deep concern in the US Congress. Between 1982 and 1984, as the conflict between the Sandinistas and Contras escalated, many Democrats in Congress began openly questioning America's role in the conflict. A lot of lawmakers felt that backing the Contras was hurting the United States' global image and contributing to significant human rights issues. In 1982, after numerous debates and hearings in Congress, the Boland Amendment was passed, which banned the use of federal funds to support the Contras. This amendment was partly a response to numerous reports about the Contras' brutal actions, which included attacks on civilians and politically motivated kidnappings. The Boland Amendment marked a significant step toward curbing Reagan's policies and effectively started shifting US foreign policy toward Nicaragua. However, this ban didn't actually stop the US administration from supporting the Contras. Despite the restrictions imposed by Congress, Reagan's administration wasn't ready to give up on its strategic goals in Nicaragua. So, a secret plan was developed to bypass the funding ban. The plan involved arranging unauthorized shipments of military equipment to Iran, which at the time was under international sanctions and struggling to get such materials legally. The idea was to use the funds generated from these transactions to secretly finance the Contras. This strategy became the foundation for one of the biggest political scandals in US history, the so-called Iran-Contra affair, which exploded in the mid-1880s. Since the US wasn't legally allowed to trade with Iran at the time, every part of the operation had to be kept hidden, especially the financial side. The money from these arms sales wasn't reported in official documents. At first, things seemed to go smoothly. The shipments reached Iran, and the profits were funneled to support the Contras. But over time, the scope of the operation grew far beyond what was originally intended, and eventually, it became too big to stay under wraps. But there's another important part of this entire operation that many people didn't know about at first: the involvement of the Contras in international trafficking of restricted goods. To fund their fighters and secure more supplies, the Contras started working with organized networks, particularly those involved in moving certain high-demand substances into the US. Such substance transported through Central America quickly became a primary source of income for the rebels. In exchange for funding and logistical support, the Contras allowed these organizations to use Nicaraguan territory as a route for their operations, which contributed to the growing influx of these substances. Over time, this flow began reaching lower-income neighborhoods in major U.S. cities, especially in Los Angeles, where a particularly potent and inexpensive version became widespread and devastating, leading to a severe public health crisis within the African-American community. For the Contras, this arrangement was partly a means of survival. But from a broader perspective, it became a major political scandal, because U.S. support for such actors not only went against international norms but also fueled serious domestic problems. By the mid-1980s, the issue of dependency on these substances in America, particularly among Black communities, had grown into a national emergency. Many believe this crisis was largely a result of operations that allowed the Contras to work with these trafficking groups. Despite attempts to keep all aspects of this effort under wraps, over time, evidence and testimonies emerged proving that the United States was not just passively aware, but directly involved in enabling this activity. Investigations that began in the mid-1980s quickly uncovered layers of unauthorized dealings, and this became one of the biggest political scandals in U.S. history. Even after the scandal broke, American authorities tried to downplay its scope. But the overall picture was deeply troubling. Iran was receiving equipment through off-the-books channels. The Contras continued their armed struggle against the Sandinista government. And meanwhile, the U.S. was grappling with the destructive consequences of increased substance dependence and social breakdown. The impact of this operation was devastating not only to America's international reputation, but also to its own citizens, especially those who suffered directly from the fallout. Gary Webb, a journalist with the San Jose Mercury News, led one of the most courageous and widely discussed investigations in 1996 when he published a series of articles titled Dark Alliance. His goal was to expose how the Contras, the anti-communist rebels heavily supported by the U.S. in Nicaragua, were deeply connected to the flow of restricted goods, particularly a form that had spread rapidly across the U.S. But how exactly did Webb carry out this investigation? Webb didn't just speculate. He worked with records, first-hand accounts, and verified data that helped support his claims. One of the key findings in his reporting was the connection between the Contras and organized networks involved in moving restricted materials. Webb described how these goods, handled in part by the Contras, made their way into the U.S. through Central America, and how they were later processed into a form that became a public health disaster. He also highlighted the direct links between foreign suppliers and local U.S. distributors, which allowed these substances to flood American streets. Webb repeatedly raised the issue of how the U.S. government, particularly the CIA, willfully looked the other way. He argued that this was part of a broader strategy to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. This information challenged the ethical foundation of U.S. policy, since widespread dependency, especially among African Americans and low-income communities, was a direct consequence of that same policy. Webb didn't just lay out the facts. He emphasized the real-world human cost borne by people who had nothing to do with global ideological battles. Webb gathered testimonies that supported his claims, including from individuals who had direct connections to both trafficking operations and the Contras. He also worked with documents that pointed to links between the CIA and foreign suppliers. However, not all of his sources were fully verifiable. Webb drew conclusions based on what could be traced through open investigation, though some elements were so deeply hidden that it was difficult to understand them without access to highly classified material. Webb's articles triggered a wave of reactions. Many major media outlets, including the Washington Post and the New York Times, questioned the credibility of his publications, accusing him of exaggeration and failing to verify his facts thoroughly. Some claimed he was trying to construct a grand conspiracy without solid evidence. However, a crucial aspect of his work was his critical approach to the relationship between the U.S. government and the CIA, a topic that quickly became one of the biggest points of discussion. Webb offered a perspective that shocked many. He also put strong emphasis on the deep social impact of the crisis, especially how the spread of certain harmful substances severely affected Black communities, who became the primary victims of widespread dependency. From that angle, His investigation didn't just shine light on political maneuvering. It helped people understand how the blending of foreign policy and domestic economic interests could lead to social disasters inside the U.S. When Gary Webb published his stories, they instantly caused a strong public reaction, especially within the African American community. He pointed out how these substances, particularly a cheap and potent street version, were being distributed mainly in inner-city black neighborhoods like those in Los Angeles, which at the time was going through what many called a full-blown crisis of dependency. African Americans, who were hit hardest by this wave, bore the brunt of its consequences. The overall impact of Webb's reporting didn't go unnoticed by national media giants. Outlets like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and others began openly criticizing Webb's series. They questioned not just the reliability of his sources, but also the accuracy of his presented facts. Under pressure from both major media institutions and political forces with a vested interest in protecting their reputations, the editorial board of the San Jose Mercury News eventually distanced itself from Webb's investigation. The paper issued a statement walking back its support, though technically, it maintained that it still stood behind his work. This was a major blow for Gary Webb. After the release of his investigation, he found himself under intense pressure from all directions. The newspaper he worked for publicly stepped away from his reporting, a move that not only cost him his job at San Jose Mercury News, but also deeply damaged his professional reputation. Many colleagues who once supported him now tried to avoid being associated with his name. This effectively shut him out of opportunities at major news outlets. His name started being treated like a liability, not because of a lack of facts, but because of the fear surrounding the implications. He found himself pushed out of a profession he had always viewed as his calling. The constant pressure from major media and political circles didn't just destroy his career, it led to a deep personal crisis. He began to feel erased, both professionally and personally. Webb started to believe he had become a casualty of a system willing to protect its secrets at any cost, even if it meant crushing the life of someone trying to expose the truth. His series, which marked a turning point in exposing government wrongdoing, left him standing alone against overwhelming forces. In 2004, after enduring years of emotional and psychological strain, Gary Webb was found lifeless in his home with 2 injuries from a firearm to the head. Officially, his passing was ruled self-inflicted. However, the unusual circumstances surrounding the case led to a flood of alternative theories and doubts. After his death, as more people became aware of his story, Webb's work began to receive a fresh wave of recognition. In particular, after the release of the 2014 film Kai the Messenger, audiences were given a chance to reevaluate his contributions to journalism. The film, which portrayed Webb's struggle to report the truth and his eventual downfall under pressure from government agencies and the press, became a powerful moment in understanding how systems can silence individuals who challenge authority. It had a significant impact by showing the depth of the problem and revealing a troubling pattern. Those who expose uncomfortable truths are often the ones most at risk. The film, along with renewed interest in the Iran-Contra affair, helped restore Gary Webb's reputation. He became a symbol of how powerful institutions often try to suppress the truth, and how those who dare to speak it often face serious personal consequences. Webb was no longer seen as a disgraced figure, but as a hero of journalism, someone who tried to expose abuses at the highest levels, even at the cost of his own life. Webb paid the ultimate price, but his story forever changed the understanding of what the government is capable of hiding.